Okay, what really happens to a person when they're starved? And I don't just mean their body, I mean their personality, their thoughts, their entire mind. Well, today we're going to dive into one of the most grueling and honestly one of the most revealing studies in human history to find out. So, let's set the scene. The year is 1944. World War II is finally drawing to a close, but this massive humanitarian crisis is just on the horizon. We're talking millions of people in Europe on the absolute brink of famine. Relief agencies, they were ready to jump in and help, but they had this huge critical question: what's the right way to refeed a starving population? And believe it or not, the science just wasn't there. And that's where a physiologist at the University of Minnesota, a guy named Dr. Ansel Keys, comes in. He proposes this really bold and, let's be honest, ethically complicated solution. He said, let's run a controlled experiment. The goal? To scientifically map out not just the effects of starvation, but, and this is just as important, the best way to recover from it. Okay, so who on earth would volunteer for something like this? You might be thinking soldiers or prisoners, right? But no, it was this really unique group of men, and they were all driven by this deep, profound sense of purpose. So these 36 volunteers, they were all conscientious objectors. Now, during the war, they were serving in non-combat roles, but a lot of them just felt like their work wasn't significant enough. And get this, they were also super bright. We're talking high IQs, and they were all screened to be in peak physical and mental health. For them, this crazy experiment was their chance to make a real, tangible sacrifice that mattered, to do something for the greater good. And this quote from one of the participants, Marshall Sutton, just says it all. Our friends and colleagues in other places were putting their lives on the line. We wanted to do the same. I mean, wow, you can really feel it, right? They felt like what they were doing just wasn't enough compared to the soldiers on the front lines. So this experiment, no matter how tough it was going to be, was their way of making a real sacrifice that still fit with their pacifist beliefs. So, with this incredible group of volunteers in place, Dr. Keys kicked off what would become a landmark, year-long journey into the biology and, crucially, the psychology of human starvation. The whole experiment was meticulously designed, broken down into 3 distinct phases. First up was a 3-month baseline period. Here, they just ate a normal, healthy diet, which let the researchers establish everyone's normal physical and mental state. Then came the really tough part, 6 straight months of semi-starvation. Their calories were slashed by more than half, and the diet was meant to mimic what people were actually eating in war-torn Europe. Think lots of potatoes, cabbage, turnips. Not a lot of fun. And finally, the last 3 months were all about controlled rehabilitation, trying to figure out the best way to bring these men back to health. And the physical effects? They were absolutely dramatic. On average, the men lost a quarter of their body weight. But get this, their actual strength dropped by 30%. Their bodies basically went into a full-on conservation mode. Heart rate slowed way down, body temperatures dropped, which meant they felt cold all the time. A lot of them even developed something called edema, which is this painful swelling in their ankles and faces as their bodies desperately held onto fluid. But honestly, as bad as the physical stuff was, what the starvation did to their minds was maybe even more shocking. It completely rewired their personalities. Remember, these were idealistic, easygoing guys. Well, they became withdrawn, irritable, and just apathetic. They lost their ambition, they couldn't concentrate, and their sex drive completely disappeared. One guy even said their little personal quirks suddenly became these great big deals. The smallest things would just set them off. But out of all the psychological changes, one thing stood above everything else. Food became an absolute, all-consuming obsession. The lack of food became the central organizing principle of their entire existence. And when I say obsession, I mean it. These guys who had zero interest in cooking before were suddenly collecting recipe books. Some had nearly 100 of them. They talked about food constantly, they dreamed about food. Mealtimes turned into these intense, bizarre rituals. Some would take up to 2 hours to finish a tiny meal, literally licking their plates clean. They became so possessive of their own food and would get furious if they saw anyone else wasting it. All right, so after 6 long, agonizing months, the starvation phase was finally over. You'd think that's the end of the hard part, right? Well, not even close. The journey back to normal was anything but simple. In fact, for a lot of these men, the rehabilitation period, the refeeding, was the hardest part of the whole thing. Okay, let's look at this graph because it reveals a super important biological truth about starvation and recovery. That dotted line you see, that's body fat. The solid line is their total body weight. So as they started eating again, you can see their bodies basically panicked. They just started packing on the fat, even overshooting their original levels, long before their muscle mass, that gap between the two lines, even started to come back. Their bodies were in survival mode, prioritizing energy storage above everything else. And here's the crazy part. Even with food available again, a whole new set of psychological problems cropped up. Remember, these were men with incredible self-control. But now, they struggled. Big time. Almost a third of them started binge eating. More than half said they'd overeat until they were physically sick simply because their bodies couldn't register the feeling of being full. That hunger switch was just stuck on. So yeah, recovery was definitely not like flipping a switch. Sure, some of the surface level stuff, like dizziness, got better pretty quick. But the deeper psychological wounds, those lingered. Their moods stayed low for weeks and weeks, and that obsession with food just didn't go away. For many of them, getting back to a full physical and psychological normal, that process took up to 2 years. Now, the experiment was a huge success in its original goal. It gave relief agencies invaluable data for helping people after the war. But its biggest, most enduring legacy, that was something nobody saw coming. It ended up completely revolutionizing how we understand certain mental health conditions. Okay, just look at this comparison. It's incredible. On the left, you've got the symptoms these healthy men experienced during starvation. And on the right, the common symptoms of anorexia nervosa. The overlap is absolutely staggering. The intense preoccupation with food, the binge eating, the depression and irritability, social withdrawal, feeling cold, it's almost a perfect one-to-one match. And this led to a truly revolutionary conclusion. For decades, doctors thought a lot of these behaviors in patients with eating disorders were the cause of the illness, that they were deep-seated psychological problems. But this experiment proved that wrong. It showed that many of these symptoms are actually just the normal, predictable, biological and psychological results of starvation itself. The cause and effect were flipped. It proved once and for all that our minds are completely tied to our bodies. When you really think about it, the Minnesota experiment is this stark, powerful reminder that our mental states, our personalities, even who we think we are so deeply shaped by our basic physical needs. And it forces us to ask a really tough question, right? If starvation could so completely overpower the minds of these incredibly healthy, idealistic, strong-willed men, what does that say about our own culture's obsession with dieting, with restriction, and with this whole idea of willpower?